All right, ladies and gentlemen, week 3 is in the books, and we are moving right along into week 4 of the 2024 fantasy football season. We got injuries, we got disappointment, we got big time players. And nonetheless, you know what we need to do as we approach the week. We need to break down every single matchup and every single player at the running back position and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting for week 4 of 2024 fantasy football. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their week 4 pick'ems are already going live, and Underdog is giving all new customers who sign up with promo code The Catch either a free Dak Prescott over half of a total yard pick'em, or if you sign up later in the week after Thursday Night Football, a free Lamar Jackson over half of a total yard that you guys can claim exclusively with promo code The Catch and use towards any week 4 pick'em action. On top of that, Underdog is also giving all new customers who sign up with promo code The Catch a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's free pick'ems and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code The Catch. That link is down below. All right, let's start with Thursday Night Football. The Cowboys traveling to face the Giants, and boy, oh boy, do we have some running backs in this matchup who do not instill any faith into my fantasy lineups or your guys' fantasy lineups. And we'll start with the Cowboys. We've got Ezekiel Elliott, who had just 3 carries and 1 reception in week 3 against the Ravens and 2.2 fantasy points. Rico Dowdle, on the other hand, I guess was the better back. 8 touches, 32 total rushing yards, then 3 receptions for 24 receiving yards, 8.6 fantasy points. I guess if I have no better options and I have to start a Cowboys running back, I would start Rico Dowdle. I guess worth noting, Deuce Vaughn had 2 touches in this game as well. It's a good matchup against the Giants. They've been very poor against the running back position. They were a little bit better against Jerome Ford and Deonta Foreman in week 3, but I just have no real confidence in starting either Cowboys running back this week on a short week, even against the Giants. I don't feel good about it. So I don't think you guys are probably in a position where you need to start either running back for the Cowboys, but regardless, they're both going to be sits for me on the week. All right, let's take a look at Devin Singletary and company for the Giants. Devin Singletary, I didn't feel as confident in week 3 going from, great matchup against the Commanders in week 2 to not a bad or good, but kind of in the middle matchup against the Browns on the road in week 3. But he showed up just like most of this Giants offense did in week 3. So Devin Singletary's stat lines read at 9.2, 14.5, and 8.8 for fantasy football points scored. And the 9.2 performance was against the Vikings, who I guess are the best team in the NFL. And that defense is, I think, unequivocally the best defense in the whole NFL. So Singletary gets bumped up to a start until further notice. He's probably your RB2. I don't think you really need to go out of your way to particularly throw him into your lineup overall, but this might be the week to do so because this Cowboys run defense sucks. It's the worst run defense in the NFL. They are just getting stomped on a weekly basis. We just saw Derrick Henry absolutely decimate them. And the week before that, we saw 4 touchdowns to Alvin Kamara, and Jerome Ford did just fine against them in week 1 as well. So Devin Singletary, I think, is a great start this week. And, like I said, it kind of depends who you're going to throw him in over, who's your RB1, your RB2, but we got enough injuries out there that probably in a position where you might be considering Devin Singletary, completely roster dependent here. But I guess at the end of the day, due to the matchup, maybe you could just throw Devin Singletary into the flex. I would expect another big game out of him. The one knock on Singletary the past 2 weeks is he has had a fumble that has been lost in the last 2 games. So, but Tyrone Tracy, 5 touches last week, 2 targets. Eric Gray, 1 rushing attempt and a fumble. So I think the Giants are probably still sticking with Devin Singletary by all indication here. So fire up the Singletary this week. Other than that, let's sit everyone else in this matchup. Let's move along to Sunday's slate. Let's start with the Bengals traveling to face the Panthers. Reminder, I have to record these on Monday before Monday Night Football has been played. It's the only way I can get these videos out for you guys. So I don't know how Zach Moss is going to look in week 3. I would assume it's probably pretty good against the Commanders. Don't know how Chase Brown's going to look. I'm going to assume he's not going to get a ton of touches, and that's going to be it. So Zach Moss, regardless, week 4, I think a solid start. This Panthers run defense was better in week 3. They still gave up a touchdown to Alexander Madison. They've still been one of the worst run defenses through the first 3 weeks of the season. So still like Zach Moss, still a solid start. Maybe the ceiling's not crazy high. I expect him to have a good game in week 3, then probably a good game against Panthers in week 4 again. So start Moss, and Chase Brown's been a sit for me all season long. That's going to continue. I mean, maybe he pops off against Commanders. That defense is awful, but I think it's way too volatile to consider in week 4. Moving along to the Panthers, who have been saved by Andy Dalton. Bryce Young's on the bench. This offense looks completely different. And not just for the wide receivers. Chuba Hubbard came through with 27.9 fantasy points. It is worth noting before that week 3 performance against the Raiders that Hubbard had 5 targets in week 2 with Bryce Young at quarterback and 11.6 fantasy points after a bad performance in week 1 against good Saints defense. It's also a good fantasy performance in week 2 against a good Chargers defense. So Chuba Hubbard, I think, just gets elevated to the start category here, coming off a big performance against a bad Raiders defense. Don't get me wrong, but this offense is going to look different. They're going to actually be in the red zone more. The receiving game has looked good for Chuba in the last 2 weeks, but especially good in week 3 with 55 receiving yards and a touchdown. So we got to keep Chuba Hubbard in starting lineups, or especially if you're dealing with injury. Chuba, like similar to Devin Singletary, like these are still guys that you drafted late that you might not need to start, but Chuba Hubbard, if you do need to start him, very solid option as we approach the week. Now, Miles Sanders did score a touchdown last week. Let's give him credit, 11 fantasy points towards the end of that game. But yeah, I'm still not confident starting Miles Sanders anytime soon. Maybe he gets more involvement because this offense continues to improve. Let's give it a couple weeks. Let's see how the Andy Dalton thing goes overall. The Raiders played awful in week 3. I do think that the Panthers will be better and their offensive starters will be better as a result of Andy Dalton at quarterback. Going to get much worse than Bryce Young there. So see what happens. But for now, we can consider Chuba Hubbard a start as we move into the week. Except we will have the Saints traveling to face the Falcons. Alvin Kamara, at the time of recording this, is your RB2 in fantasy at 15.7 fantasy points in week 3. No touchdowns, 87 yards on the ground, 3 grabs for 40 receiving yards. That was his worst game of the season so far. And if that's the worst we're going to get out of Kamara, then I'm okay continuing to start Alvin Kamara. Falcons' run defense has been okay so far on the year, but we're going to continue to fire up Alvin Kamara basically no matter what. Game script didn't help Kamara necessarily in week 3. He's not going to give you 4 touchdowns every single week. We all knew that. So Kamara, no reason to consider a sit anytime soon. Jamal Williams, the RB2 on this Saints team, continues to be a sit until further notice. We'd have to see, like, God forbid, a Kamara injury to even consider Jamal Williams. And then basically we got the same thing for the Falcons. Bijan Robinson might not be playing at a crazy high ceiling, only has 1 touchdown on the season so far. Did find that touchdown in week 3 against the Chiefs. His fantasy points read as 16.1, 16.2, and 13.2. Safe floor. Have to kind of see what the ceiling becomes on the season, but no question about it. We're starting Bijan week in, week out. Tyler Algier, similar to Jamal Williams, just a handcuff option and nothing more. I mean, we've seen 9 touches in week 2 and a reception, 7 touches in week 3, but yeah, we're going to see a lot more before we consider Tyler Algier getting anywhere close to a start. So Kamara, Bijan, fire him up. Everyone else here, just handcuffs. Next up, we will have the Jaguars traveling to face the Texans. This will be interesting. Once again, I haven't seen the Jaguars-Bills game at the time of recording this, but Etienne's been solid through the first 2 weeks. It's a good matchup in week 3. Buffalo's run defense has been pretty weak, so I expect Etienne, unless he suffers an injury, to be a start. If something major happens or if my view really changes on the players who play in Monday Night Football, it'll be in the pinned comment in the comment section down below. So Etienne, even if he has a bad week in week 3, you're probably still starting. Tank Bigsby's been banged up. You got Dearness Johnson roaming around and Keelan Robinson, but Etienne's the only running back in fantasy for the Jaguars that we are starting anytime soon. Moving along to the Texans, we got a banged up Joe Mixon. He didn't play in week 3, who might play in week 4. And then we got Cam Akers. We still have no sighting, I should say, of David Pierce dealing with that hamstring injury. So, I'm probably going to start Joe Mixon if he plays. If he doesn't play, I'm probably going to start Cam Akers. I don't really want to look at any other running back on this Texans team. I think it's Mixon or Akers, whoever plays due to Mixon's health, and that's where we have to leave it at. So if you own Mixon, the volume's still going to be there. That volume went down in week 2 because he got hurt. When he's back and healthy, he's going to be a solid start. We know the ceiling. Saw it in week 1, 26.8 fantasy points. Akers, the game script didn't help him this past week. He did have a receiving touchdown, 9.9 fantasy points. So that was all against a very good Minnesota Vikings defense. Akers probably fine, safe floor if he's the starter. Mixon, once again, fine, safe floor if he's the starter. All depends on Mixon's health as we approach week 4. We will have the Broncos traveling to face the Jets. And okay, we got some changes here for the Broncos backfield, which has been a stay away for me this season. I haven't really encouraged you guys to start any of these players. And Tyler Batty, the leading rusher in week 3, 9 touches, 70 yards on the ground, 7.78 yards per carry, 7 fantasy points. Javonte Williams had 6.1 fantasy points, 4 targets, 4 receptions, 12 yards on the ground. Jaleel McLaughlin had 8.4 fantasy points. He had a reception for 7 receiving yards and 7 touches on the ground. 5 touches on the ground, 7 rushing yards, and he scored the touchdown in this game. So this is why this backfield is a pure stay away for me. Okay, and I was going to leave it at that. If you're going to start a Broncos running back, you are really crossing your fingers. And the Jets' run defense, bad through the first 2 games of the season. They were not bad whatsoever in week 3. This defense might be starting to come together. They held Ramondre Stevenson to essentially 0 fantasy points after he had 20-plus fantasy points in the first 2 games of the season. So I'm not going to feel good about starting any. Ramondre had 21.6, then 17, 0.3. Those are his last 3 starts. So fact check myself. But yeah, I'm not starting any Broncos running back anytime soon. Breece Hall, we're starting no matter what. I don't care if he's facing the 1985 Bears. We're continuing to fire up at Breece Hall, top 10 fantasy running back. A touchdown every game this year so far. 18.3 or more fantasy points every game so far. Braylon Allen. This one's interesting. I put him in the flex. I think you could flex Braylon Allen this week against the Broncos. Broncos overall were good against the running back position in week 3. Bucky Irving got a little bit loose, don't get me wrong, but they were still pretty stout and give up a lot of fantasy points to the position. Rashad White's a different story. But, I don't really know what to expect out of this Broncos defense on the road this week, and I don't really believe that they're going to be a great, they somehow took advantage or took complete control of that game against the Buccaneers in week 3, and that did not help the game script for the running back position on the Buccaneers. So kind of a tough read. And then on the other hand, right, the Jets in week 3 pulled ahead early and were dominant on both sides of the ball, and that allowed for even more opportunities for Braylon Allen in week 3. He had 11 touches, 55 yards, 5 yards per catch, then 3 targets, 3 receptions, and 13 receiving yards, 9.8 fantasy points. And obviously the week before in week 2, he had 2 touchdowns, 1 rushing, 1 receiving, 19.6 fantasy points. So it's going to I think game script could really impact, maybe the Broncos running backs, but definitely a running back like Braylon Allen. I think for now, he's okay in the flex. I think that we're going to continue to see involvement out of Braylon Allen, even with Breece Hall as a starter. But you got to understand that there's volatility here for Braylon Allen. The floor is there and the ceiling's there, and you're taking a gamble if you throw him into your starting lineup. But yeah, I don't think there's many running backs right now who are RB2s, outside of situations like Monty and Jahmyr Gibbs, that we can consider as starts, especially behind a guy like Breece Hall. But I want to go ahead and risk it a little bit here and say that Braylon Allen could certainly be a flex option moving forward and as we approach week 4. Let's move along to the Vikings, traveling to face the Green Bay Packers. And boy, oh boy, Aaron Jones with another big performance. Didn't really show up too much in week 2 against the Niners, but he still had 9.8 fantasy points. Had the fumble in that game, or else we would be looking at a double-digit stat line in that game. So Aaron Jones, 18.9, 9.8, then 25.8 in week 3 against the Texans. And the nice thing with Aaron Jones, in week 3, we saw just a dominant passing attack for the Vikings, but Aaron Jones got a receiving touchdown and he's had 5 receptions, 6 targets in the last 2 games. So he's part of that passing attack. And really what I've said so far on the season, if you drafted Aaron Jones, you're probably just starting him. He's your RB2. You take what you can get, but right now, the time I'm recording this, he's a top 12 running back in fantasy football. Let's just keep taking what we're given out of Aaron Jones. Gets a bad Packers run defense this week. Jonathan Taylor just tore them up in week 4. And against the Jets run defense, been a little wishy-washy. See what happens. We just talked about them in week 5 before he hits that bye week in week 6. So Aaron Jones, till further notice, is a start, and Ty Chandler is just a handcuff. That's all he's been for me so far on the season. Has not been start worthy, just a pure handcuff. He's going to stay at that. He has had 7+ rushing attempts in each game this year. A little bit of receiving work in week 1, but I just have no confidence in starting Ty Chandler anytime soon. Jones, a solid start, though. Now, looking at the Green Bay Packers, is Jordan Love going to play? Is Malik Willis going to be the quarterback? I don't know. But it doesn't really matter to me. The volume's still there for Josh Jacobs. For the most part, we had a little bit of an interesting development in week 3. We saw 14 touches to Jacobs and then 12 to Emmanuel Wilson. So if you guys watched Saturday's video, last minute waiver wire ads, I had Emmanuel Wilson on the list as a really solid handcuff option. That's all I had him as. It was a handcuff option. And like I said, he ended up with 12 touches, looked pretty sharp, 4.17 yards per carry, but then he also had a receiving touchdown. So I don't know. We just talked about Braylon Allen. Maybe we're going to see Emmanuel Wilson get more touches and be a part of this offensive game plan. But am I going to find out against this Vikings defense in week 4? No. Maybe we'll try again against the Rams or the Cardinals in the next 2 weeks, but I'll go ahead and sit Emmanuel Wilson, a very strong handcuff ad off the waiver wire at 6% rostered. Like I said, talked about him going into week 3. He's the true handcuff to Jacobs. Marshawn Lloyd's on IR. AJ Dillon's been on IR, and then Chris Brooks got elevated from the practice squad and had 3 rushing attempts, and he's not the guy. It's Emmanuel Wilson. So, Josh Jacobs definitely struggled in week 3, 3.07 yards per carry. Emmanuel Wilson looked good. This is a tough matchup against the Vikings, but I'll trust Josh Jacobs as a lead back in week 4, unless you just have way better options at the position. All right, next up, we'll have the Steelers traveling to face the Colts. So, got Najee Harris in the category. You can start him if you need to. He is dealing with an arm injury, so he might end up not playing. In that circumstance, I would elevate Jaylen Warren to a start for the week, primarily because we know the Steelers want to run the football. I know Jaylen Warren's been really bad, and he is also dealing with an injury, an MRI on the knee, so we don't even know if he's going to play, what does that leave? Cordero Patterson? Listen, the point being, if you have a healthy running back going against this Colts run defense right now, we can start them. Like, the ceiling might not be crazy high for whoever starts for the Steelers this week due to these injuries, but the matchup's there, so I think the floor is okay. Najee's gone with 8.9, 8.4, and 13.6 fantasy points. He's perfectly fine. Not really going to go out of my way to start him, but then once again, we don't know if Najee's going to play. We don't know if Jaylen Warren's going to play. We might be rolling out Cordero Patty and Cheese against the Colts this week. And at that point, yeah, the matchup's there, but you're still kind of going with a desperate start. So let's monitor the health of the Steelers running backs and just know that there's a really good matchup here if you need it. Okay, for the Colts, Jonathan Taylor, very good performance in week 3. Solid performances in the first 2 weeks, 10.8, 15.5, but now a 2-touchdown performance in week 3, 26.5 fantasy points, 110 yards on the ground after having 103 on the ground in week 2. JT, we know what we're getting here. It is a bad matchup. The Steelers defense, one of the best in the league, been good against the run, but we just got to continue to start Jonathan Taylor. I don't think you guys can afford to sit him. And yeah, maybe be wary of this matchup, but come on, it's JT. We're starting him. Trey Sermon, Tyler Goodson, Whoever it is left on this team behind JT, nah, we're not starting them. JT, good start, even against a bad matchup. And let's keep an eye on the Steelers running backs as we move in to week 4. All right, we have the Rams up next, traveling to face the Bears. And boy, oh boy, man, you had like a doomsday clock going there for Kyren Williams going into week 3. Basically, no offensive line, no pass catchers on this. I mean, there's some talented pass catchers here. Yeah, you still got Stafford at quarterback. You still got a great play caller and system behind Sean McVay. But really, I mean, if you're opposing defense going up against the Rams, it's like you got to try and, force them to run the football and see what happens, especially near the goal line. And Kyren Williams said to the Niners, I'm your doomsday clock. I mean, 31.6 fantasy points, 24 rushing attempts, 89 yards on the ground, 3.71 yards per carry. Not great, but his best mark of the season. 2 rushing touchdowns, 2 receptions for 27 receiving yards, and that 3rd touchdown. So maybe it's partly because the Niners defense has been pretty poor to start the season. Maybe it's just because Kyren Williams is very, very good in this role. And, I've said since there started to be those big concerns for Kyren Williams, returning punts and all this, going into the year, my thesis has always been that Sean McVay is going to run Kyren Williams into the ground and give him a massive amount of touches. And he's a top 5 running back in fantasy football right now. And that looks to be the case. I mean, especially on, when this team was in the red zone, it was like, what are the Niners doing? Like there's no other option here other than Kyren Williams, essentially. I mean, I'm not downgrading that there is some talent still in these backup wide receivers on the Rams, but Kyren Williams, end of story. He's a start until further notice, and we already knew that anyways. But Blake Corum, no touches in week 3. No usage in this offense. Ronnie Rivers had 2 touches. I mean, this is Kyron's backfield. It's not even close. He's a workhorse running back. He's a start, no matter what. Oh, gosh. Let's talk about the Bears running backs. If you guys were here in the offseason and you're watching this part of the video, I just want you to leave me a mean comment. Like, I deserve a mean comment for having any belief in DeAndre Swift, who is banned from ever being drafted to another one of my fantasy teams ever again. Ever. 3 yards per carry in week 1. I thought that was bad. 1.29 in week 2. I knew that was bad. Gave him potentially, if there's nothing else on your team, which I did have a team where I drafted Pacheco and Christian McCaffrey and DeAndre Swift. And I was forced to start DeAndre Swift this week. There's nothing left. And the matchup is here against the Colts in week 3. And boy, oh boy, 1.54 yards per carry. He improved compared to week 2. 2 receptions. DeAndre Swift is sit for the rest of our lives. I'm never starting DeAndre Swift again. Khalil Herbert had 0.9 fantasy points. Roschon Johnson had 10 fantasy points. So maybe start Roschon Johnson. I don't know. This Rams defense not good. Poorer against the pass than they have been against the run, but still not good. There's no way you're rolling on a Bears running back with any confidence this week. 8 touches, 5 targets to Johnson, 4 touches to Herbert, 13 touches, and 4 targets to Swift. Committee backfield, the offensive line still sucks. At least we got some life out of the passing attack in week 3, but moment of silence for all fantasy rosters with DeAndre Swift, including mine. Let's move along. All right, moving along, let's talk about more disappointment. Look at the Eagles traveling to face the Buccaneers, and no disappointment with the Eagles running backs, but we'll get to Rachaad White in a minute here. So Saquon Barkley, the RB1 in fantasy football at the time of recording this, he is getting nowhere near your bench. I don't care who he is facing. Love this guy in the offseason. A guy I'd argued all offseason long needed to be higher in rankings and drafted higher, drafted more aggressively. And we're seeing it on the field. 33.2, 17.6, 33.6. Those are his marks in the last 3 weeks of fantasy football. 5 touchdowns through the first 3 weeks of the season. This Tampa Bay run defense has not been very good this year. Barkley must start. Gainwell, Shipley sits. this is Barkley's backfield. Let's move along to another running back who I had a lot of belief in still, who was the RB4 in fantasy football, full PPR last year, and that's Rachaad White. The Eagles' defense hasn't been great this year. You could give Rachaad White one last chance. I definitely have more faith in Rachaad White right now than I do in DeAndre Swift, but I am worried if I'm a Rachaad White owner because Bucky Irving looks dang good in this offense and is way more efficient. I mean, he wasn't very efficient against the Lions in week 2. They're one of the better run defenses in the league, but 6.89 yards per carry in week 1 for Irving, 7.78 in week 3. Todd Bowles has come out and said that Bucky Irving has earned more touches in this backfield. Rachaad White still has that PPR value and, the pass game involvement. That gives him some legway here. But, man, if you own Rachaad White, you got to be a little bit worried because you probably drafted him as your RB2, and you still spent somewhat of high draft capital on him. So, I've been a long time Rachaad White truther. You guys can also leave me a mean comment for believing in Rachaad White. Bucky Irving, 11.4 fantasy points in week 3. Maybe not a super high ceiling, kind of close to like how we looked at Braylon Allen. Probably okay in the flex, but once again, like until this kind of smooths out, between White and Irving, like I don't know that I'm super crazy about like starting, Bucky Irving over like a bona fide running back. Like you'd have to be in kind of a bad spot to start Bucky Irving and throw him in the flex, but we'll see how things go in the next couple of weeks. I think we'll start to get answers, and I think Irving will certainly be more involved. But it is worth noting that between Bucky Irving and Rachaad White, we've seen no touchdowns this year so far. So all those red zone looks are going to Evans and mostly Chris Godwin. So or we've seen Baker run for a touchdown. I think he's the only player on this team who's ran for a touchdown. So we'll see what happens. White, Irving, shaky situation. Hopefully, he didn't draft Rachaad White all over the place like I did. And Saquon Barkley, come on. No question about it as we approach week 4. Next up, we have the Patriots traveling to face the 49ers. And man, Stevenson, one of my must-start running backs last week against a Jets defense that was playing poor against the run the first 2 weeks of the season. One of the worst performances at the running back position in all of fantasy football. I mean, worse than Rachaad White, worse than DeAndre Swift, was Ramondre Stevenson with 0.3 fantasy points in week 3. Volume was super high in weeks 1 and 2. The game script did not help him in week 3. This Niners defense not playing very good right now. I'm not going to downgrade Stevenson to a sit, but he's kind of in that category. Maybe it depends on what else you have. I don't want to completely rule out the Niners at home here, just being a defense that we don't need to worry about, but they've looked really poor through the first 3 games of the season. Kyron just ran all over them, 3 touchdowns. So maybe not my favorite start this week. We got to kind of see what this Patriots offense looks like as the next few weeks start to roll on. But Stevenson, maybe just slightly downgraded here, but probably still an okay start. Antonio Gibson's got, more and more work in the past 2 weeks than maybe we expected. 11 touches in week 2, 5 in week 3, and also added 3 receptions in week 3. It's been pretty efficient at 8.73 and 5.8 yards per carry in the last 2 weeks, respectively. So, Gibson probably still a sit. Not enough there for me, but certainly worth keeping an eye on. To me, he's just a handcuff to Ramondre Stevenson, who hopefully bounces back in week 4 after looking awful in week 3. All right, Jordan Mason kind of came back to earth. That game script wasn't very positive for him against the Rams, but was still solid. 4.05 yards per carry, 77 yards on the ground. Didn't find the end zone. Kind of thought he would against a bad Rams defense, but Juwan Jennings was the only Niners allowed to score in that matchup in week 3. So Mason continues to be a solid start. I mean, he's going to get that volume, 19 touches in week 3, 28 and 20 in weeks 1 and 2. So Mason not going anywhere near our bench. Then Isaac Arando got a little bit more involvement in week 3 with those injuries, behind Jordan Mason on this team. Maybe a good stash if something happens to Mason. Right now, he's the RB1 on this team. But at the moment, he's nothing more than a handcuff. 5 touches, 19 yards on the ground, 1.9 fantasy points for Isaac Arando. Mason, a good start. Stevenson, hopefully a good start, but gets downgraded a little bit. That's it for this matchup. Let's move on. Next up, we have the Commanders traveling to face the Cardinals. Once again, reminder to make these videos, record these videos before Monday Night Football has been played. So I don't know how Brian Robinson has looked in week 3, but he's very solid through the first 2 weeks of the season. And I think he'll probably continue to be a solid start against, what is overall a poor Cardinals defense. So Brian Robinson Jr., probably a safe start. If there's a major injury or my view really changes, it'll be in the pinned comment down below. Austin Eckler's been solid through the first 2 weeks of the season as well, getting involved in the receiving game. Got more touches in week 2 than week 1. So Eckler probably in that, you probably still have to be desperate to start him where you drafted Austin Eckler, but might end up being a viable option if you have nothing better, once again, against this poor Cardinals defense. So if anything changes, that'll be in the pinned comment down below. And then we have the Cardinals. We finally saw James Conner come back to earth. I mean, this Lions run defense is for real. They held him to 1.89 yards per carry and 1 reception, 3.5 fantasy points on the day. He should bounce back against a bad Washington Commanders defense overall. So he's still, at the time of recording this, before Monday Night Football has been played, a top 15 running back in fantasy football. He'll be okay. We can still roll James Conner out there. Trey Benson had 2 rushing attempts, 0.8 fantasy points. Stay away. Amari DeMarcado, 2 rushing attempts, 0.7 fantasy points. Also a stay away. So let's start our studs here. Let's not overthink it. And let's move along. All right, next up we have the Chiefs traveling to face the Chargers. The time recording, it's a little bit tough to evaluate this matchup because we don't really know what's going on with Justin Herbert and that ankle injury and how will that impact J.K. Dobbins and I guess the Gus bust. But on top of that, we got this Chiefs backfield that's all over the place. And maybe it's not all over the place, but I just still don't feel great about it. I mean, going into week 3, I was not really keen on starting any Chiefs running back unless he had nothing better. I mean, I don't actually recall telling anyone in our live Q&A streams to start Steele or Purine because A, we didn't know how this split was going to look. And then B, for most of the week, we didn't know if Kareem Hunt was going to be elevated from the practice squad. And, Carson Steele, I will say, is leading this backfield right now. Week 3, 17 touches, 72 yards on the ground, look good. 4.24 yards per carry, 2 targets, 1 reception. If you guys go back to the end of the offseason, I was really high on Carson Steele as a pickup in dynasty leagues, as a last, late round draft selection and underdog draft. So I do like Carson Steele. But I don't feel good about this situation, especially against a good Chargers run defense. We didn't really see any goal line work for Carson Steele. The Chiefs were throwing the football towards that area. I just don't feel good here because now we have murmurs that Clyde Edwards-Helaire is going to come back after I don't know exactly what week it is. He can come back, I think, maybe week 5. And then we don't know if or when Kareem Hunt's going to be elevated from the practice squad. Samaje Perine, 3 receptions, 15 receiving yards, 25 yards on the ground, 7 fantasy points. I just don't think there's a high ceiling for either of these running backs if it's just Steele and Perine against the Chargers run defense. So I'm not starting any Chiefs running backs again in week 4. I mean, you can. If you're desperate, you can. And sure, this is the Chiefs offense. One of these 2 guys can score a touchdown, but that's what you're crossing your fingers for. I mean, you have to be in a bad spot, to consider starting them. I'm just not there yet. And we'll just have to see it come to life before I'm going to have any confidence. And then, I don't know, maybe the end of the week, Kareem Hunt, it gets elevated from the practice squad. It's a stay away for me. All right, Chargers. I have J.K. Dobbins as a start, but I am worried about J.K. Dobbins this week because, I had him as a sit last week unless you were desperate because I did not like the matchup against the Steelers. Now he gets another not bad matchup, but not a great matchup against the Chiefs. But on top of that, Justin Herbert, dealing with that ankle injury. We don't know if we're going to see Taylor Heineke or Easton Stick or both or Justin Herbert in week 4. If we get a backup quarterback here, I just don't like this matchup for J.K. Dobbins. I mean, matchup's okay, but really I just don't like the game script for J.K. Dobbins. So J.K. Dobbins I'll have as a start because he's still the clear-cut RB1 here for the Chargers and getting the volume and all that stuff and the running back we want to own. And I mean, once again, similar to like Carson Steele, there's always a chance that J.K. Dobbins stumbles into the end zone and gives you enough points. So Dobbins, I think worst case scenario start. Other than that, I'm not going to consider J.K. Dobbins a strong start this week. Gus Bus, I had hopes for you in the offseason. But I'm going to go ahead and say you can drop Gus Edwards, and we're not starting him unless we see an injury to J.K. Dobbins, which I guess he has an injury history. But honestly, yeah, early bye week for the Chargers in week 5. Gus Edwards, just drop him, and we're not starting him in week 4. All right, let's move along to the Browns traveling to face the Raiders. Jerome Ford still found 10 fantasy points in week 3. Wasn't pretty, but he got those double digits. Deonta Foreman, I wasn't super high on going into the week unless you were just desperate. Was maybe a good last-minute pickup to see if he was going to be more involved, or I guess you could consider him the handcuff to Jerome Ford. But he did nothing in week 3, 0.5 fantasy points. So he's on the sit list. Ford continues to be a start, 10 touches compared to Deonta Foreman's 2 touches. Then we're like, we're not getting any involvement out of Pierre Strong because he's got that hamstring injury. You got Naheem Hines somewhere on the pup list. Like there's nothing else here. So, I mean, Deonta Foreman is the running back to own if you're trying to handcuff Jerome Ford, but that's about it. And Ford is getting all the volume. And I don't think Nick Chubb, the way this offense is playing and this team is playing, I don't think Nick Chubb's going to be rushing back from that injury anytime soon. And that's been my thesis all offseason and current season long. That's the right terms there. But Ford, good start. This Raiders run defense is bad. Chuba Hubbard just went all over the place on them this past week. So Jerome Ford, I think, is a solid start. Maybe you don't have to start him. He's probably a bench guy, but he's going to get, the Raiders, the Commanders, the Eagles, the Bengals, the Ravens in the next coming weeks. Good opportunities for Jerome Ford. He's going to continue to be in the start category. All right. The Raiders. Told you guys last week, going into week 3, if Zamir White does not have a good day against the Carolina Panthers, you can drop him. So let's just drop Zamir White and let's just move on with our lives. Another guy I had high hopes for in the offseason. You look back to what Zamir White did at the end of last year as the RB1 for this team, 17.5, 14.5, 15.6. I know we don't play in week 18 for fantasy football, but 13.1. I don't know what's happened. But Zamir White at this point is off my rosters. There's no hope. No hope for Zamir White. Alexander Mattison has a touchdown every game this year, but the ceiling's low. I mean, I guess ceiling is 16.2 fantasy points, which is fine, but 16.2, 6.1, 13.4. He is getting the goal line work. Like, he had 3 grabs last week for 37 receiving yards. Then he had just 7 yards on the ground. But he's getting the goal line work, and he scored a touchdown. So, do I love Alexander Mattison? No, but whether we like it or not, he is the running back on the Raiders to own in fantasy football. And because he gets that goal line work and the receiving work, he's in the category. Don't love him this week, It's a home game for the Raiders. They played really bad last week, so you got to be desperate to start Alexander Mattison. But if you got nothing better, he's 45% rostered, might be out there on the waivers. Throw him out there and cross your fingers. That's about what you're going to get with Madison as we move into week 4. All right, next up we have the Bills traveling to face the Ravens. Once again, I have to record these on Mondays early. I'm sorry, Monday Night Football has not been played. I don't know if James Cook has another monster game or a decent game. If he has a major injury, if my views change on him, it'll be in the pinned comment down below. But for the most part, if Cook's healthy, even if he has a poor performance in week 3, we're continuing to start James Cook. This Ravens defense doesn't really scare me. The run defense has been okay. The pass defense has been okay, but they're giving up a lot of points overall. And honestly, I don't trust this Ravens defense whatsoever. So I think that the Bills can come out here and have a big day. So James Cook, a start. Ray Davis is nothing but a handcuff, a good handcuff, a prospect I really like going into the year as a rookie, but he's nothing more than a handcuff until further notice. Derrick Henry, finally. My theory was in week 2, we get that performance that reminded us of who Derrick Henry is. as a player and a fantasy player, and why I was so aggressive in drafting Derrick Henry going into the year, similar to Saquon Barkley, a player I argue should be higher up in rankings and ADP and all that stuff. And it wasn't week 2, although week 2 was good. But it was week 3 against this Dallas Cowboys run defense that is abysmal, where he had 25 touches, 151 yards on the ground, 6.04 yards per carry, 2 touchdowns, and a 23-yard reception for 30.4 fantasy points. Don't care who Derrick Henry faces. We're starting him on a week-in, week-out basis. At the time recording this, he is the RB3 in fantasy football. Moving on to Justice Hill, he's a desperation start, and you got to look for a good game script. At Dallas was a good game script. He only had 7.4 fantasy points. Buffalo at home, this could be a good game script again, but you're just crossing your fingers that he gets enough receiving work, that he gets you close to that 11.5 mark that we saw in week 1 against the Chiefs. So I've said this since week 1, we're not going to get 8 targets, 6 receptions out of Justice Hill every single week. Just no way. So no touchdowns on the season. He's a sit for me. You got to be really desperate to roll Justice Hill out there, and it has to be in a full PPR league against a good team in which the Ravens are continuing to need to throw the football and keep the game competitive. So for the most part, Justice Hill is a sit. Pretty easy evaluation for this matchup. Cook, Henry, start him. Everyone else, more than likely, a sit. So we will have the Titans traveling to face the Dolphins. Interesting matchup here. Let's start with the Titans side of things. Tony Pollard on my must-start list last week did close to nothing. 5.9 fantasy points after having 18.4 and 15.2 in the first 2 weeks. That Green Bay run defense has not been very good on the season, and Pollard didn't really do anything with it. Now, this was a pretty dominant performance by the Packers, and game script wasn't there. The passing game's bad. Will Levis turns the football over. We know all that stuff. This Dolphins run defense is awful. They're really bad. And on the flip side, Zach Charbonnet, for example, was a must-start running back on that same list last week because he was going up against the Dolphins. So it was a good matchup in week 3, but Green Bay really showed up on the road. I think things will be better on the road this week for the Titans going up against the Dolphins, at least at the running back position. I don't know about much else, although maybe their defense shows up against a third-string quarterback. But Pollard will keep him as a start. Now, that leads us to Tajay Spears, who had 10.1 fantasy points in week 3. But this is a tough one because he had those 4 receptions for 54 receiving yards. If you take that out, he had 2 touches for 7 rushing yards. So we definitely want to keep an eye on Tajay Spears, whose roster percentage has been dropping. A player who's drafted but hasn't really seen the involvement that we've wanted. 7.2 points, 5.1, 10.1. So this might be an outlier. It's kind of close week 1. Not really confident in starting him yet. This is similar to Justice Hill. You just have to be completely desperate. It is a good matchup. Crossing your fingers for enough, maybe not just receptions, but receiving yard total, and then crossing your fingers for a touchdown, which I think that's just going to go to Tony Pollard. So Tajay Spears, just a sit for me. And let's move on. Okay, Dolphins. My viewpoint for one more week. Start Devon Achane, and you sit everyone else. I'm not confident in Raheem Mostert if he plays. I know he's been out the last 2 weeks. Not confident in Jalen Wright, who did have 2 touches this past week. Not confident in Jeff Wilson, who had 3 touches this past week. And I'm not confident in Alec Ingold, who had 1 touch this past week. And just credit, 3 receptions and a fumble. But I'll start Devon Achane because he's still a super talented player. He probably is going to get downgraded for you, but it's going to be really tough to sit Devon Achane where a lot of you guys drafted him. So, yes, the upside is limited because of the what we're expecting at the quarterback play, but it's just so hard to bench a player like Devon Achane. So, I'll start him. If it looks really bad again this week, the panic meter can rise and we can sit him and only start him based on matchup until Tua potentially returns. But here in week 4, I'll still give Devon Achane the nod as a start. Moving into the week. Final matchup of week 4, we've got the Seahawks traveling to face the Lions. And we don't know if Kenneth Walker is going to play in week 4 or not, still dealing with that oblique injury. The Seahawks have been, taking this as a very cautious approach because they feel like they have a viable running back in the meantime in Zach Charbonnet. That has proven to be true. Charbonnet, double digits every game this year so far. Even in week 1, when Kenneth Walker played, he still had that receiving touchdown. So 12.1, 17.9, 25.7, 2 touchdowns in week 3. So I do think there's a high chance that if Kenneth Walker needs to, he sits again in week 4. I will say this is the most competitive matchup the Seahawks have had all season long. They face the Broncos, the Patriots, and the Dolphins without Tua. It's Lions team, obviously, for real, and this is a good run defense. So I'm not going to expect as high of a ceiling for Zach Charbonnet this week if he's the starter. But I still think Zach Charbonnet is a solid start if he ends up being the starter. Kenneth Walker is healthy and plays. Still think he's a solid start as well. But maybe limit your expectations against this Lions run defense. But I think for the most part, you own Walker, you own Charbonnet, you're probably going to want to start those guys due to the upside and their overall volume. Gibbs, Monty, every single week, they're going to be a start for me no matter what. You see the asterisk next to David Montgomery. It's because he got a little banged up in week 3, but it ended up being nothing. It doesn't matter. Ignore the asterisk. Start Gibbs. Start David Montgomery. No matter what. That's been my thesis all season long until we see something different. And David Montgomery is the RB6 in fantasy at the time I'm recording this. Jahmyr Gibbs is the RB13. So Monty has been the running back to own, but Gibbs has not been bad by any stretch. He has 2 touchdowns on the year compared to Monty's 3 touchdowns on the year. Gibbs 17.4, 17.6, 16.3 in fantasy. Monty 16.3, 17, 21.2. I mean, both these guys are balling. They're going to continue to get a lot of usage on the ground and through the air. We know the story here. Start Gibbs, start Monty, end of story. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering every single fantasy football question in the comment section down below. If you guys need anything at all moving into the week, start, sits, waiver additions, trades, roster reviews, injury updates, whatever you guys need, let me know. I'll answer every single comment in the comment section before Thursday Night Football and before Sunday's slate of games. Guys, don't forget, we're going to have everything you need for Week 4 2024 fantasy football here on the channel throughout the week. Start sits at every position, must start defenses, must start kickers, running backs, wide receivers that you can't afford to bench, buy low options, last-minute waiver additions, everything that you guys need, and live fantasy Q&A throughout the whole week. So make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so you don't miss out on anything. And with that, I'll say, thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.